We had the manifestos last week. It was really great to read through some of them. As I said, the format was not necessarily specific to one kind of way, because obviously we saw the way that Jard put his in bullet points, but some people wrote essays, some people wrote, you know, a list of principles, some people wrote more of a kind of like musings of what they think is important to them right now as artists, because obviously the point of the manifesto is that it is inherently premature, right? Because like, how could you really know what you want to say right now? But the point is you can know what you want to say right now at the same time. Both things can be true at the same time. It's sort of to get you used to understanding that starting your practice now is just as valid as starting it in 4 years when you graduate. It's like you're going to constantly be updating what you feel, how you feel about your work, the way you think about it, the way you talk about it. So the idea was to get the ball rolling with that initially with that. So it was great to read through them. And I wanted to highlight one of them because it's something I try to do with each assignment is, you know, have some either read to what someone said or show someone's work based off an assignment. And one of the manifestos that moved me the most was Sarah Herbert's assignment, right? So I want you to come up and read it to the class. I want you to read, and again, this is an early manifesto, this is an early expression of who you are, but this is where you are at this point in time. So come up and read your manifesto. All right, we got you.
I write, not because I have to, but because I need to. I write, not because I can't speak, but because the silence is mistaken for surrender. I write because I have a moral obligation to represent the neglected, the overlooked, the vulnerable, and those whose voices are just as powerful as any other, yet are constantly being drowned in a sea of privilege. I write not only because it matters deeply, but because it demands to be heard. I write in solidarity, standing with those who believed in my greatness despite our circumstances, which whispered, you'd be lucky if your future was even dim. I write to carve a deep cut into a system designed to break people who look like me, as I navigate the depths of a field that was never meant to be easy for us to succeed in. I write because film is my personal weapon. I slay my enemies with words that cut deep where the truth has been buried. I write to confront those whose fragility leaves them feeling entitled to compensation for the very injustices they've inflicted on others. I write to honor and praise the silence, not to soothe the guilty by feeding into their badges polished to blind us. I write because I refuse to shield a system that refuses to see us. I write to review the interconnectedness between the brothers slicing mangoes on the block, the Mr. Softy man who gave me a free ice cream in the midst of a sweltering block summer when my mother was 50 cents short, and the teachers who teach with what they know to children who, at the time, were blind to the systems designed to keep them small. But I grew, somehow, and now I find myself here, a place that forces me to reflect on the injustices that shaped me. And I write, not to reminisce, but to reimagine what justice could look like for us, had we not been buried from the futures we all deserve.
Oh, it was great. It was great. Thank you. How does that connect from what we talked about last week? What was kind of one of the main things we talked about last week in relation to the power of our images and why we should be very, you know, careful and intentional about the way that we're crafting our images? Somebody want to share with me?
One of the things that stuck out from what you said when you showed the clip from Birth of the Nation.
Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah, Birth of the Nation.
It can have a major impact on how people see the world and how people see other people and shape people's perspectives with what you choose to say in a film, you choose to show.
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the reasons, right? Because we saw the power of some of that imagery. We saw the power of a certain framework being grounded in a certain ideology, right? And then that obviously having an impact. So that takes us to what we're going to talk about today, which is basically we're going to ask, how can artists exist simultaneously within systems of power? Because that is something that's inevitable, right? Right now, you're existing in a system of power. Right now, you are in a very particular and interesting time. I think recency bias might have us always think like, wow, this is crazier than ever before. But I remember, you know, I feel like the Iraq War was really terrible and crazy as well, you know, but this is a particularly terrible time, right? And so there are systems of power that are going to shape inevitably the work that you are making, right? Regardless of whether you want to be consciously engaged with that or not, your silence or your lack of silence is framed within that, right? There's no way to escape that. So it brings us to something that Chance the Rapper talked about on his new album. I feel like it's a bit of a comeback. I think it's better than The Big Day, but no shade to The Big Day, but I feel like this has a different energy now. He says, what is violence if not silence on the song Letters? And so I think the idea as well goes to something that Audre Lorde talked about too, which is that if we kind of decide that because there are oppressive forces coming down on us, or we feel like maybe there's a high risk in expressing what we feel, that perhaps we may as well not say anything. But that's a different kind of violence if you don't say anything. If you feel that there's something wrong and you feel like you want to maybe put it into your art, but you still are not necessarily, sharing that out of fear, so to speak, right? We want to try to learn ultimately to do what maybe Wolfgang Tillmans does in his work, which is ultimately to look without fear, right? You want to be able to look and create without fear, right? Even in a system that is difficult to create in. So today we're going to jump around 3 central texts. These are all the texts we're going to look at today, but the main texts we're going to look at are basically Art on My Mind by Bell Hooks, Crime and Punishment, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and The Creative Process by James Baldwin. Some of these other texts will jump in there if we have time, but the core ideas and the core principles of these texts are going to be kind of what shape the conversation of today, which ultimately is about how do artists within systems of power assert themselves, okay? Maybe you get some ideas about how to do that yourself. So one question I have for you all is, if we are aware of the inherent power of our images and the impact that some of these larger ideologies can have on our images, how do we proceed? What do we do? What's our response? If we have to be conscious about these things, if we have to be, vigilant, what are some of your solutions or proposed solutions?
I think one thing that's really important is to actually speak and hear from some of the people that you're trying to portray about whether it's a certain situation, a certain experience, or just things that they experience that you may not, so that you're getting a first-hand perspective and you're not portraying something incorrectly, or whether it's correct or not. If it's something doesn't have to be deemed not bad for other people to not like what it is. And so I think speaking to the people that it involves is really important. Yeah, it's almost like if you're representing someone, perhaps you really need to create a real dialogue with them. Yeah, and I think that's something that is often, there's a posturing at times where people maybe say that they do that, but it is very important to represent people in your films, not from almost like an idea of those people, but represent the people themselves. There should also, a good sign is if there's always a reference point to someone who the character in the film actually is based off of, so to speak, even in your mind, even if you're not going to publicly talk about that in interviews, but ideally there's someone in your film that is rooted in a real person that you have come to know, that you've related to, right? As a deep reference point. And maybe that's private for yourself, but I think that's a good way to check yourself on okay, am I really going all the way here, or am I staying in my comfort zone of just safe creativity? Safe creativity is a dangerous space to operate in because it's a very self-fulfilling space. It can become an echo chamber. And one of the reasons we have to think about that is something that Bell Hooks says in Art on My Mind. She talks about how just because we're aware of a larger power at play doesn't mean that that is enough, so to speak, right? We need to kind of actively act on that. So she says the system of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy is not maintained solely by white folks. It is also maintained by all the rest of us who internalize and enforce the values of this regime. This means that black people must be held accountable when we do not make needed critical interventions that would create the revolution in vision. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about. How does this revolution in vision take place, right? We're going to look at that both in the way that Dostoevsky was writing his work, and we'll also look at that in the way that James Baldwin thinks about his work, right? So before I get to that though, I would like to ask you if art really matters, right? We're thinking about these things so critically, but we're not building roads, so to speak. We're not providing, free healthcare, right? That's not necessarily what we're doing with art. So maybe all of this thinking, maybe all of this resistance is poorly placed, right? Why do we have to do this through art? Why is art a place where these kind of thoughts have to take place? And it's not a leading question. Maybe someone thinks that that's not the case. But why is art important? Why are we doing this?
I think it's interesting that you say that, we're technically not building roads. When you said that stuck out to me, because I think that in a metaphorical sense we are building roads. We are creating new ideas. We are pushing the boundaries in certain ways. So I feel like in a way it is building roads, but maybe not in a tangible way that people can, walk on.
I think art really matters because I wrote all of us, at least we had to write the essay about
what film changed us, and we've all had that moment where a film has changed what we thought and everything like that. Especially today in a world where like everything's kind of depressing, it's nice to have something to connect with people.
I think that art matters because it's what starts like the movement. Like nobody just passes a bill or like builds a road, as you were saying, like just out of nowhere, and one person can't decide to do that, and you need enough people to rally to like support whatever the idea is and to spread awareness. And I think that like one of the most effective ways to like the person before said, change minds and get like a big group of people to support your cause is to express it through some type of art. And then that's what leads to like the actual action, but you can't jump straight to the action. You need the movement to be made ahead of time.
You need the movement. Yeah, that's beautiful. The root of the movement, right? I mean, we think about how All Right was almost an anthem for when the protests started some years ago, right? Like you need something that's going to kind of start spiritually and ignite people into action, and art can very much do that. I want to look at two works of art that Bell Hooks specifically talked about. For those of you who don't know, Bell Hooks is a wonderful, Black feminist writer, one of the great thinkers of our time. I would think will go down in history as someone that is just as respected and revered as some of the ancient philosophers of the past. To me, she's kind of that new version of that for us, for a world that's changing. And she talked about The Getaway, 1977 painting by Margot Humphrey. And she talked about how during the many years, this is in Bell Hooks' voice, she says, during the many years that I remained in a relationship that was heartbreaking, I found hope and renewal for my spirits in this image of union between lovers, of joyous escape, right? So you think about the fact that she sees this image at a time when she is on the daily going through a relationship that is killing her spirit, right? And if she's looking at this image, she's able to kind of imagine something that is different from her current reality, right? So obviously we could say like, well, it's just a painting, but that painting is imbued with a certain amount of meaning, right? It's imbued with a certain meaning that is specific to the person who's looking at it. And that means that the painting contains a certain power, right? A certain expressive power that can communicate an ethos or kind of a message to somebody who can relate to it. So this is what Bell Hooks said about The Getaway. She also talked about this Andres Serrano Circle of Blood piece. And she said that Serrano's image restored my appreciation for blood as a life-giving force. These are just two examples of the ways in which beautiful works of art have concretely and constructively influenced my thoughts, my habits of being. She talked about how blood was something that she was very averse to, right, beforehand because of past experiences. But in a way, looking at the presentation of this could ultimately inspire her to view blood as this kind of generative element within our lives, right? So again, art can show you something in a different way, maybe even show you something that you previously viewed distinctly or in an opposite fashion or in a negative fashion, and it could switch it for you if you give it a chance to. So let's think about that when it comes to human existence. What elements of our very existence are difficult for us to grapple with, and what are our tendencies when not engaging with art of dealing and coping with these things? We look at James Baldwin. This is from his essay, The Artistic Process. He says, the state of birth, suffering, love, and death are extreme states. Extreme, universal, and inescapable. It's going to happen to all of us. We all know this, but we would rather not know it. That's key there. We would rather not know it. There are certain realities that we live with that we would rather not have to deal with, right? The artist, though, is present to correct the illusions to which we fall prey in our attempts to avoid this knowledge. So think about yourselves of correcting certain illusions in your family, in your daily life, right? In your friendships, in the social dynamics that you see around you. You see the lies that people are telling each other. You see the blinders that people are putting on. And as an artist, you can be devoted to the act of saying, no, I'm going to show you what you're afraid to see, because we can experience a better horizon if I just show you that, if we both see it. That's what Baldwin's talking about in that essay. It's an incredible essay. It's uploaded in the drive for you guys to read in its entirety during the week when we finish. And that brings me to a wonderful piece that something that Jomo Fray said. How many people know Jomo Fray in the room? How many people know Nickel Boys? There you go. That's the man that shot that. That's the man that framed those images for you. So in my next publication here in Homesickness, Volume 2, Jomo Fray talks about this very interesting recent ideation of his. He said that the phrase evil is sentimental has been fascinating to him. He says, I would even argue to say that power is sentimental. And this is him talking about the way in which a society can potentially find justifications for negative frameworks of thinking. He says, part of it is a return back to a relationship that it yearns for. This is in terms of evil. You know, almost like an Aristotelian kind of conception of telos, where an acorn's telos is towards a tree. It's something that it naturally kind of moved towards. I feel like there's something in that. And evil being sentimental, that has a connection to evil's own telos. Just the ways in which so much oppression, or at least modern oppression, is packaged in this wrapper of a return to a nostalgic time. Think about the big phrase we've been hearing of your generation, make America great, make America great again, right? You hear that all the time. It's this idea of kind of returning to something that previously existed, which maybe didn't even actually exist, right? But there's a packaging in there, right? Evil finds a justification through this interesting kind of nostalgia, through this sentimentality, right? In order to kind of package it and have it be accessible as an idea that can permeate amongst other people, right? And gain support. So these are the ways in which a society can start to justify different frameworks of thinking. And it's important to understand that tendency, because your society does that just like the individuals in your life might do that. It's a natural thing. It's not even necessarily blaming anybody, but it is something to realize. It's like we can see what our peers, what our human compatriots here in this world are basically engaging in their own self-limitation. And as artists, it's important for us to try to peer into that, both in ourselves and also both in the people that we see around each other, in the society we live in, the systems of power. Because if we don't have that, one could make a people lose touch with their capacity to create. We could lose sight of their will and their power to make art. And only then would the work of subjugation, of colonization be complete, right? So if you don't do this, if you don't engage in this process of reminding and checking the human beings around you along with yourself, then you can actually end up with a society that is not creative, a society where art is not being made. And that is a deeply scary society. And half of my ancestry comes from a society like that. The longest standing dictatorship in Latin America was the Dominican Republic under Rafael Trujillo, 33 years. And it is not a coincidence that a place like Dominican Republic basically is only just now starting to have a film tradition. We had no cinema in the 60s, no cinema in the 70s, nothing in the 80s. Had one movie or a few movies in the 90s, right? Once a dictator and his kind of remnants were gone. But the power of oppression on the artistic space is very strong, right? So you got to realize that these aren't just ideas. There's repercussions to giving in and being silent. So think about that in the art that you're making. I also want to be clear that I'm not here to politicize you, but I'm just here to speak about a reality, right? You exist as artists. Art is political. There's no way for them to be detangled. And I'm not even really saying that your politics have to even be the same. Hopefully they're not. Hopefully this is a very nuanced room. But you're understanding that your art exists in a political context, because a political context is a context that is in relation to power. That is inseparable from the art that you make. Okay, so we have to guard ourselves as well from focusing solely on the work itself. Some may say, well, a work can be beautiful in and of itself, and I don't need to think of it on its, socio-political merits. And, this leads to a deeper question, which is important to ask, which is, can you be aware of and appreciate I'll fix that, the politics of a work without abandoning an appreciation for its aesthetics? Can a work possess this dual function? So basically what I'm asking is, can you appreciate something on its aesthetic merits, period, without even questioning, what is this saying? What is it about? Like, I just love how it looks. I love how it feels. I love how it sounds. But at the same time, can it also be something that's politically viable? Can it be something that is saying something socially? I want to hear what you have to say.
Wouldn't this kind of be like separating the art from the artist type of thing? Like, couldn't you put it in the opposite way? Like, can you separate the politics and, like, if it's problematic or if you don't agree with it, with, like, the fact that it's a good piece of work? And, like, I would argue that you can.
Okay.
Because you can appreciate beauty without having to do with, like, the message and the work behind it.
Yes. So you think in a way you can look at, but you think that it can function in both ways. Do you think that it's like, okay, it can be beautiful, but there's also a way where I can look at what its messaging is. You don't think that one negates the other?
No, I
Okay.
think that they can be separate.
Okay, good, good.
I think that in order for a work to carry its political message, you have to appreciate its aesthetic. You can't receive a political message if you don't attach the work through some other way.
Good.
And so I think a piece of work can be aesthetically pleasing.
I see that.
And you can ignore its political function. You can see past that. And if you're not, very if your literacy in politics is not very strong, you can just look at stuff for its aesthetic. Although I'd argue that you attain much greater pleasure and enjoyment out of art if you're able to see what it means beyond what it shows.
Yeah, that's interesting because that tees us up for next week, where next week kind of leaves the realm of ideology for a moment and starts to just say, like, well, how do we see? What are the essence? What are the elements of aesthetics? And what is the way to kind of, visually or filmically make something beautiful or engaging, right? So that then the message can be communicated.
Kind of adding on to that, I feel like you can use aesthetics not only through appreciation, but also maybe more disturbing aesthetics or visual choices to communicate the political aspect of the piece as well.
I think that personally, film is different pieces that make a whole. And I feel like if you're engaging, not just film, but if you're engaging with art, I feel like this is a harsh term, but if you're choosing to ignore one piece in service of another piece, is that not sort of refusing to engage with the art itself? Like, isn't that sort of anti-art in that sense? Like, if you're watching a movie like La Haine, where it has so much to, not a good French pronunciation, but there's so much to say, they're doing so much, there's so much on the politics of France, on the status of young people there, but instead you're choosing to, say you disagree with that, you're choosing to ignore that, but to instead say, wow, this movie, is doing so much interesting stuff with dolly zooms and depth of field. And is that not refusing to engage with the art? Is that not anti-art?
I'm going to show you guys a film that has been very, very celebrated in film circles because there's something about it that is just, it appeals to so many filmmakers. It's one of those, I think it's one of the greatest films of all time, but I think your question is pertinent, which is like some of these people appreciate the way that the action is directed. Some people appreciate what's going on with the zoom lenses. Some people appreciate just like the texture of the spaces. But it's like, yeah, but what's this movie about also? Like, is that separate? Is that separate? I believe that they're inseparable, especially in the case of this film we'll watch, but it's literally the point of the question.
I wanted to bring up like Childish Gambino's "This Is America."
That's right.
I feel like something.
Shout out Childish Gambino.
Something could be like so visually jarring as far as like the video that you can abandon the aesthetics of it. Like I went back and listened to the song just without the video, and it was like a sonically pleasing song, but the like visual aesthetics and the political messages in the video kind of took everybody's attention away from that. I think something like visually, if it's like music and video or something like that, something visually can be so jarring and so in your face that you can abandon the like just surface level aesthetics of it.
Yeah, because I love the song Loyalty on Damn. What's that really about? Maybe people just love to hear Rihanna sing and, Kendrick and Rihanna just vibes. I hear you. Yeah, and I think that I like the fact that you guys have brought up two questions because one of the main things, as I said, about this class is that it's a thought space. And one thing I say in my advanced production workshop, the year-long that I teach on Fridays, is the question is always more important than the answer. So the questions that your peers are asking, those are questions you should be putting down for you to answer, right? I can offer up my potential answer to it, but I think these are questions that we need to consistently be grappling with throughout our artistic practice as we develop our artistic practice, because you are right. It's something I grapple with to this day. I'm working on a film myself, and I'm like, sometimes I just want the scene to hit right. Like sometimes I just want it to feel a certain way, and I'm not thinking about what this is about. But then I'm like, man, but what's packaged in that? What's packaged in the reason for why I like it? What's packaged in the reason for why I feel like, this rhythm is key or is on point? Is it grounded in some kind of blind spot that I'm not aware of that we talked about last week? But these questions are very key. So question is always more important than the answer, especially in these creative thought spaces related to art. So let's watch a scene from Gilo Pontecorvo's The Battle of Algiers, 1966. One of the great political films, also one of the great films of all time. So this is a film that ultimately is about the clash between the Algerians, right, and the French basically were colonizing. And we follow this trajectory of the Algerian fight for liberation. Now, it is a film that is known for incredible, kind of very live documentary feeling set pieces, right? There's incredible explosions that take place in the film. It's also a film that is seen to be as an incredible case study of guerrilla warfare. There's many merits that the film has. It's one of the most long-lasting and influential films. Now, in this narrative, in the scene that we just saw, that scene doesn't move the plot forward. If you're in like your screenwriting class, you know, and they have this scene and someone tells you like, well, this doesn't advance the plot forward. Like there is literally no need for this. Your protagonist isn't even in the scene. This could have very well been a deleted scene. But I would say that this is one of the scenes that to me moved me the most when I watched it. Because in spite of the plot progression, in spite of showing the chronicling of this fight for resistance, this kind of intriguing plot, you need the pathos, you need the redemptive quality in the work, right? And when we see this beautiful wedding that takes place, honestly, with these characters, I'm not to spoil it for you, but those characters don't really like appear again. They're not really in the movie that much. I mean, they come in and out, but they're not who we focus on. But just having this incredible scene of unity, right? Of this oppressed group of people having to find a way to have these marriages indoor because they can't openly have the marriages, but nonetheless, we're seeing the beautiful kind of spirituality and kind of unity that comes from that, where you see the camera rising up and then you see that wide panning shot, and objectively we're seeing those aesthetics, right? As our friend over here was talking about, something that is just beautiful in general, right? But I would say that this scene is also inherently political. The very inclusion of a scene like that is very inherently political because, especially at the time, 1966, this is not too far away from the Algerian fight for liberation. So to show these people on screen, to show a marriage on screen within the Muslim Algerian community is an act of resistance. It is a political act. You are showing a group that a massive part of the world is actively oppressing. You say, no, we're going to spend time. We're going to show the wedding. We're going to show them together, rejoicing in a moment of love, especially finding the little bit of joy that they can find, especially in a difficult time period. So to me, this scene right here is inseparable from the political implications of it, even though it is a scene that is very beautiful and has beautiful music. Anybody know who did the music? That's right, tell me. Ennio Morricone. Spaghetti Westerns, Fistful of Dollars, right? Good, Bad, and the Ugly. One of the great composers of all time, right? But not necessarily known as a political composer or political musician, so to speak, but did contribute objectively great music that is wonderful film scoring, but in a film that is deeply political. So I think that they are not necessarily separated from each other. So again, thinking about whether you can separate these two is important, but I would argue that you can't. So let's go on to Dostoevsky now. Fyodor Dostoevsky, giant of the golden age of Russian literature in the 1800s, along with Tolstoy, along with Ivan Turgenev, along with Chekhov, comes a little bit later. So in Dostoevsky, we see political dissidence, and we also see existentialism. He is also one of the people that has most impacted existentialist philosophy in the realm of literature. Okay, Notes from the Underground, one of the great existentialist novels. Anybody want to know the most prominent film work that is very influenced by Notes from the Underground? Who knows? Taxi Driver, right? Okay, so from our very own here, right? One of our big alumni from here. Taxi Driver, directly inspired by Notes from the Underground. Also, some of the writings of Dostoevsky directly influenced the works of Bresson. Bresson's Pickpocket, which all of you will probably see maybe in language of film, is a direct reference to Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. So very, very influential thinker and novelist and, incredible, kind of artist of our time or of our history. But let's go to the year 1849. 1849, why can't I? There we go. 1849, we see Dostoevsky about to be sentenced to death, right? So he was part of a literary circle that was critical of the Tsar. This is Tsarist Russia. This is Tsarist Russia in a time when the material realities of the society are starting to change inherently. And so the current power structure is feeling the instability of that. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing. And Tsarist Russia is feeling like, damn, we are really less and less relevant. How can we convince this massive group of people that we really do hold dominion over them? And obviously you'll later find that you have the socialist and communist revolution that comes after that. But in 1849, Dostoevsky is sentenced to be executed. Okay? Now, the Tsar ultimately decides, unbeknownst to Dostoevsky and the rest of the Petrushevsky circle that he was a part of, which is the literary movement that was critical of the Tsar, they don't know why the sentence was walked back on, right? Basically, the sentence was, you know, it was staged, but it wasn't done. And so ultimately they were sent to go to Siberia and exist in exile for the next 5 to 6 years. Now, there's a great passage in The Idiot, which is a great novel by Dostoevsky, that talks about the experience of literally being on the brink of thinking you're going to die and then realizing like, oh shit, I'm not going to die. I actually have life left to live. Whoa, like it's an incredible passage. You have to go see it. You have to go read it. But it's important to realize that even before Dostoevsky wrote Notes from the Underground, Crime and Punishment, he's someone who was a journalist and who had been writing short stories and also some other works that inherently were responding to the political situation, were also responding to the structure and systems of power. What's interesting is that Dostoevsky himself was not necessarily very critical of the Tsar, right? Other members of the Petrushevsky circle were much more critical, but nonetheless, he was a writer whose work was getting prominence at the time, and he was sentenced to death by being associated with this circle of people, right? But what's interesting during this time is that Dostoevsky goes from a radical idealist to an artist probing the psychology of ideology. So he goes from being somebody who maybe is steeped in ideas more so as a younger thinker, right? Someone who's journalistically writing, into someone who in his later great novels is going to be talking about how can we break past the limitations of these ideologies that a society can steep itself into and sort of trick itself into believing the justification for. So let's talk, before we do, let's talk about the voiceless speaking and creating. Because while Dostoevsky was in Siberia, he was experiencing jail life. He was experiencing jail life with many people that were not from his same educational background. Dostoevsky was literate, he was an engineer, right? And he's with a lot of people who ultimately had very different, social circumstances, and also is sharing prison cells with them. And incarceration is going to be a very key theme to the rest of this class, especially with the artists that we're going to have visit us in the second half of the class. Let's read this passage from The House of the Dead. The House of the Dead is ultimately Dostoevsky's piece of prose that is a chronicling of the time that he spent in prison. He says, I once saw a convict who had been 20 years in prison and was being released take leave of his fellow prisoners. There were men who remembered his first coming into prison when he was young, careless, heedless of his crime and his punishment. No pun intended, I guess. He went out a gray-headed, elderly man with a sad, sullen face. He walked in silence through our 6 barrack rooms. As he entered each room, he prayed to the icons, and then bowing low to his fellow prisoners, he asked them not to remember evil against him. Now, outside of context, this is just a very important passage, because think about the fact that not many people could read at this time who would be able to relate to this passage. So a prisoner was not going to be able to read this passage. So even the act of chronicling this, putting it into literature, is also a response to a system of power, right? What are the limitations of whose story gets to get told? And think about the equivalent of that in your own society. Think about who makes your clothes. Think about where your sneakers get made. And think about whether those people get a chance to tell the story. We think about Illmatic, which is the wonderful Nas album, and that to me being the modern day version of what Dostoevsky was doing in the 1800s, because again, that's what's beautiful about the material advancements of our world. We were talking about AI last week, and I never said AI was something terrible. It's just a matter of how do we use it in a human way, right? Who do we use it in a way that's specific to what we can do as human beings in the society and artists? And what's great about the material advancements of the 20th century is that finally certain people who had to go and get permission to be represented by someone who could read, somebody who could write, is like, no, give them the microphone, right? Let them make the beats and let them tell the stories, right? So what's beautiful is you have Nas telling the story of his homies, the convicts that are up in Rikers. And later, you won't even need Nas to tell the story, because then people who are up in jail, will be able to actually, record from inside jail. How many people know Anuel AA? Anuel? No? Well, Anuel did it. Well, you know Anuel. He did his little recording from jail. we go to Crime and Punishment, and we see that it was written in 1866. This is well after the time that Dostoevsky has gone through his political dissident period. Now, it explores the tension between ideological theory and moral reality. Think about the fact that those two things are maybe not one and the same, right? What happens when one man, Raskolnikov, the protagonist, dares to set himself above the law? This is a young man who's impoverished. This is a young man who is advanced intellectually, but is also finding himself deeply frustrated with his socioeconomic political situation. Okay? So he is a man who we can have sympathy for, but his methods and his measures ultimately cause us to question, like, oh shit, even the ways, even as people that could be potentially oppressed under systems of power, our behavior and the way we respond to that system of power can also be inherently destructive as well. So he believes in the extraordinary man who can transgress morality for a higher purpose. Okay, he rationalizes the murder of a pawnbroker as a test, someone who he felt was insignificant or not contributing to society, right? And so he embodies a certain hubris of ideology that's divorced from human consequence. He thinks that if he carries out this murder, nothing will happen to him. But ultimately, as the novel unravels, his psyche will unravel, and guilt, paranoia, and human alienation will start to overtake him. And his theory fails when tested against lived, embodied experience. Because Dostoevsky dramatizes the cost of abstract ideas imposed on human life. Remember, we talked about those political ideas. The idea is that we can't just exist in the realm of these rational justifications. Through art, we find a way to connect these ideas to the real human experience, the spiritual experience, what we're living on a daily basis. Okay? So, let's look at what Dostoevsky is talking about in his notebooks. I want to show you guys the notebooks and I want to show you guys the letters because remember, this is art and practice. So we're thinking about somebody who has an idea of what they want to write and then we're going through the process of writing it. It's a very interesting experience that Dostoevsky goes through here where he says, the Russian nation always suffered. The characters of arithmetic kill and direct faith saves. All became confused, nothing to believe in, nothing on which to make a stand. In his image, the protagonist, in the novel, he's expressed the idea of extraordinary pride, arrogance, and contempt for all society. His idea is to take that society into his power. Despotism is a trait of his. It goes to meet him. And then he says, no, I'm not ready. I'm full of pride and falseness. I'm only just beginning all the processes of transformation in jail. This is after the character is imprisoned in the novel. So these are some of the letters that he writes to some friends of his. He says, the law of the earth take their toll. And he ends up being forced to denounce himself, forced, even if he should perish in jail, to rejoin people. The feeling of isolation and separation from mankind, which he felt as soon as he committed the crime, wore him down. The law of truth and human nature took its toll. Think about how ways in which your art can start to show that law of human nature, maybe clashing up against some of these, I guess you could say, hollow ideas that the world tries to place on us. Now, Baldwin goes back and talks about how there's a reason that the artist exists and that the artist is different from the politicians, the legislators, the educators, the scientists. He says the fact that the artist is his own test tube, his own laboratory, working according to very rigorous rules, however unstated these may be, and cannot allow any consideration to supersede his responsibility to reveal all that he can possibly discover concerning the mystery of the human being. That's what we're doing in our practice, that's what we're doing as artists. We're trying to figure out the mystery of the human being. And so, what did Dostoevsky do in the practice of it? He has this intent. He has an entire manuscript. 1865 in November, he has a lot of the novel written, but it's written in first person. So what does he do? He burns it. He burns the whole novel, burns his writings. He says, I'm going to start again. He says, I have a new form, a new plan, it carried me away and I started afresh. And the idea is that the shift from first person to third person, omniscient, basically, as the critic Chulkov talks about, is it allows the first person narrative, basically thinks that the first person narrative was insufficient. It wasn't suited to give the reader an impression of all the complexity and psychology of the plot. So the idea is that if you're rooted in one specific subjective perspective, that might not be sufficient to conveying the broader, larger idea. And it goes to something that Bell Hooks talks about when she says that we have to resist familiarization in our imagery sometimes. Sometimes if we are just mimicking images that we came up with, that might be too safe of a space. And I think our version of challenging certain visual tropes is Dostoevsky's way of going from first person to third person. Dostoevsky wrote Notes from the Underground in first person. He found success that way. But in terms of what he was trying to figure out here, of showing how the human experience goes past, it breaks past the ideological space, the rational space, he was like, first person narrative is too limited. I need to move past that. So this third person omniscient is going to be able to show me the larger reality, the larger objective view that each individual human being is not privy to. That's what he was doing when he changed that. So think about ways you can do that in your own imagery, in your own art making. James Baldwin says that artists are a breed of men and women historically despised while living and acclaimed when safely dead. So the idea is that there will always be criticism while you're making your art. You'll always come up against barriers. You'll always come up against people who say, that person doesn't know what they're talking about. That person is too radical. That person is too safe. That person is, it's not, they can't categorize necessarily what you're doing. So they're going to bring you some form of criticism that you're going to have to face. And maybe when you die, they will appreciate the messages that you gave them. Now, maybe it doesn't have to be death, but it might be after the act of creation. Now, what's interesting is Baldwin says that the peculiar nature of this, your responsibility, the responsibility of the artist to their society, is that they need to be at war with their society for its sake and for their own. So, if you're trying to make something, right, and you're trying to communicate something, your role in relation to society is to push up against it, to push the barrier, not just for your own sake as an artist, but for the sake of the very society that you feel limited by. Because you're like, I know that you can't see the way, but I will show you the way through my art. That's the idea. The idea is that the reason you have art that's existing in tension with power structures is because you're trying to fix the power structure for its own sake. Because you hopefully believe that there is a better horizon, there's a better human experience, right, in store. So this is the deep cut. It says, drive to the heart of every answer and expose the question that the answer hides. Expose the question that the answer hides. So the idea is you're making a work of art. You arrived at an answer. But now there's a question within the answer that you just found. And that's what it is. Exposing the question that the answer hides. We got to let that sit for a little bit. What is the question that the answer hides? Hopefully in the films that you make here, in the work that you make in your life, you'll start to see different examples of that along the way. So, this leads us to a more human dwelling place, right? Because that's what Baldwin said was our ultimate aim, ultimately, which is trying to find a more human dwelling place. And there's a beautiful description from our guest that's going to kind of be with us today. It's Allen-Golder Carpenter. He has of dreaming of a newer future. I think he did it in Black Internet, where he talked about ultimately a prisonless future. And I think we'll have that be assigned reading to them. But I think that it'll be interesting to show some of your work beforehand so that they can see, in a way, how Allen has been able to kind of think about the experience being a Black American in relation to systems of power and how that's manifested in the films that he's made, but also in the performance pieces that he's done. I remember being in Berlin talking to Allen about the film that he was working on, that he was editing. It's a film called Sojourn. And he's literally moving the camera within Blender. He's showing me the different places that he can put the camera. And I'm like, this is filmmaking. But, we're not on a set. Maybe we're sitting there looking at a set. We're experimenting with it within a set. But we may not be physically out there getting crafty and eating, food on the set. Maybe the crafty joke is too soon because you haven't been on sets. Well, first thing I wanted to ask is, and I'll only ask a few because I want to get to the students. Mm-hmm. It seems to me as well in both your films, Black Internet and in Sojourn, mm-hmm. that in a way you're almost creating your own Black archive mm-hmm. of memories, lived experiences, media, all of that together. Can you speak to the way you use all these different sources?
My practice is I try to approach hyper contemporary culture with the same kind of respect and gravity that a librarian approaches archival materials, and not weighting the sometimes decades necessary for things to enter into a canon before treating them with importance. Um, and then as some of you might have noticed, there's clips that I used in both films. And part of that is because like my own like kind of understanding of the importance of some of these clips continues to like grow over time. Um, yeah, and then Black Internet is actually a continuously like evolving piece that like each time it's like exhibited or it's screened, like I usually change it. That one was it's up to the fourth version, but that was I think the third version. Um, and that's because I continue to like come into contact with new things that I want to like kind of almost put in the filing cabinet of that work. And literally like a friend will send something to me, like send me like a Instagram story and be like, you have to use this clip, and I'm like, I got it. Yeah, I put it in there, you know, and so like there's a lot of clips from like a lot of like rappers from like where I'm from because, you know, like a lot of times, especially like, and I do a lot of work that references like black music, particularly like rap music, but and so much is the case with more like kind of underground artists. A lot of that stuff isn't documented very well, and especially like before, like pre-internet stuff. So like kind of using my own practice as a way to kind of help maintain and perpetuate the voices of artists that kind of impacted me, like, you know, growing up, which wasn't really that long ago, you know, and like in some of those rap artists were, you know, people from my neighborhood or like people that know people that I know, you know, like came to my graduation, you know. And these are artists that had like an impact on my work and the work of others, you know, influencing the music of others. So yeah.
What I think it's kind of speaking to the fact that you repurpose certain footage across projects, and it's almost like sometimes if someone doesn't use a piece of footage, you know, they're like, oh wait, this is from my last film. If I use it in this, it's almost like the idea of the film as a final entity is almost not as legitimate or respected. Like, I feel like you kind of remix that a little bit, or you flip it on its head, because there's like the way that some footage from music videos will exist in Black Internet can be in Sojourn, but to me, because the context is different, it's almost entirely like they're not the same. They're their own thing.
I mean, but also like, you know, there are some things that are like worth saying multiple times, and you have to say them multiple times to get the point across. You know, and like one of the clips that I used across both films is of a rapper from like around the corner from like from me, and you know it's him pouring a bottle out for one of his friends that passed away, another rapper, who is I think the older brother of someone I've known since I was like in third grade, and you know and the reason why I think that clip is so important and so beautiful is because one, it's referencing like an ancient like African spiritual tradition of libation, and something that a lot of people like in the hood do and not even realizing that it's kind of in alignment with this like generational thing, you know, and you know because of all of part of my practice is like, you know, being African American and like kind of being and like the inherent nature of being a black person in America and my kind of ancestry being severed at a certain point and like kind of finding those connections back to like the original continent. But then also like and then that's the song in the video is like very important because, you know, like a lot of my practice and a lot of my like kind of philosophy on exhibiting and presenting work is based around this idea of cultural exchange, you know, and kind of being through my practice, kind of bringing my culture to new places and to other places and meeting people and their cultures. Because that song is produced like with, I don't know how many of you guys know Young Lean. He's like a Swedish rapper.
I know Young Lean.
No, very,
a couple Young
very,
Leans.
very important, very influential artist over like the last, like over a decade, you know, but but he collaborated with a lot of like underground like rappers from like the East Coast over like the last like 10 years. So these two like very different contexts, these two very different worlds, but are able to kind of find a common ground. And then that song, like one of Young Lean's like producers like sent him that beat, and he made that song to honor a loved one. So it connects like all of these kind of important points in my practice between like kind of like history and spirituality and cultural exchange. So that's a music video that I like kind of continue to come back to.
Hello, I have a question that just covers the whole two films. What is the significance of deconstructivism and reconstructivism to your filmmaking in terms of, you mentioned the word hyper-contemporary, because we live in a time where meme culture or everything is just chopped up into like snippets, and then you seem to have chosen to utilize that side of the time to kind of like reconstruct, gather pieces from here and there and reconstruct them into kind of like a, what's the word, like maybe like enigma for us to like decode what you actually want to, because like I don't really see a narrative, for example, in Black, what's the first one?
Black Internet.
Black Internet. Maybe it's just I didn't really get it. Maybe there was, but I don't really see like a traditional kind of a sense of trajectory of story or whatever. It's just a bunch of videos and memes pieced together, and I feel like there's a core, but somehow, like me personally, I fail to get that core, but I know that it's there. So why do you choose to use this type of filmmaking, a very, like, I would say extremely contemporary one that is like almost like ahead of the time, rather than something that is like, I don't know, maybe for the audience is more like familiar? What are you trying to experiment with it, if that makes sense?
Okay, okay, there's a lot there. No, I appreciate it though. I fuck with it. I mean, like, for one, like these works, both these films like exist to kind of, for me to kind of cope with something, and like working through my feelings on something, and sometimes as those feelings change, the works change, and I go back and change those things in like in real time, and with the video Black Internet, like I set about intentionally making the most like kind of opaquely black thing I could make. This is like, I just kind of say I wanted to make the most nigga video I could possibly make. Kind of intentionally kind of making something culturally opaque, and to kind of go with like, and looking at it, and I was thinking like, I can't really understand what an outside viewer would feel looking at this, but I saw like a film by like I think he's like a French filmmaker, but he like lives in Germany. His name's Siberian, and he made this film where it was like this like very densely culturally German film, and I remember watching it and thinking, I was like, I don't really know what any of these references are, but I fuck with it because I can still like feel something. I can tell this is about something. I can feel something, and that's the most important thing for me always, is that like, to communicate like a feeling above all else, and that's, and to kind of go back to what you were like saying before, like about like kind of when you're talking about like aesthetics and like versus like kind of the politics, is like, for me, like whether something hitting in my soul is like the most important thing first, and like I don't even know what all of what I just showed you means. But, and maybe I'll know next time.
What do you feel as an artist is the question that you are trying to answer the most and trying to rise to the audience in your work?
I think that for me, like, kind of the most important thing for me is to kind of like is for people to kind of never lose sight of where the people keep in mind like where something came from, and like in not allowing things to like be lost. And because like for me, like my greatest fear is like a loss of like any kind of like information, knowledge, or like history, and then this film is like kind of a meditation around my own kind of like an existential crisis about like, like who am I to carry, to be the one to kind of to carry these things? Who am I to be the preserver? But I think it's on the individual to like kind of take the responsibility into their own hands to kind of be a steward of culture, but also like also I always just try to like I just try to like kind of I always want people to never back away from the thing, because there's other works, there's works that I've made that like it might have been a little controversial, but like in terms of their subject matter, it's like I never wanted to back away from the thing, and I never want anybody to ever take any kind of half measure. I want people to say the thing they want to say, and not be afraid of the conversation that it's going to create.
I just want to say one thing about the role of incarceration or the theme of incarceration. I mean, you've done, was it earlier this summer, right, or in the spring? You did you did the piece where you were literally in an art gallery. You turned it into a jail cell. You lived there for 3 days, going through what other inmates have gone through, people that come from your community. We've seen it across your work, even here, where I feel like in a way he's almost entrapped in a certain way. Can you talk about like the importance of the lineage or the experience of incarceration and within your community, and how you express it in your work?
So, I mean, well, one of the earliest, I tell this a lot anytime that question comes, anytime a version of that question comes up. Like I always like kind of lead with like kind of like this like kind of short anecdote about how like one of the earliest memories that I have like is going with my like mother and sister to go like retrieve my brother from jail. And then one of the second earliest memories I have, particularly pertaining to my brother, is being like taken aside and like kind of peeing in the cup for him because he was on probation, and like kind of not really understanding the context of what that was until much later, and kind of putting the pieces together like much later down the line, and then kind of like unpacking that and thinking about that, and like kind of, and then as well as growing an understanding of how like incarceration and is kind of built, and there's so many things just kind of like woven into the architecture of our society, because architecture isn't just a physical thing, it's a philosophical thing. And so like it, so from the very beginning it's like there, and then like for instance like my high school I went to, the joke growing up was that like, oh yeah, your school looks like a jail. Like, oh, you go to Bladensburg, you go to the jail. I'm like, and then so I was like, okay. So I kind of looked into it, and come to find out, like the firm that architected my prison is also like the head architect has a background in incarceration and like correctional design.
The firm that architected your high school makes architectural design for prisons.
Yes, right. It has connections to the Department of Justice and Department of Defense. They and is actually like the firm that built my high school oversaw like the reconstruction of the youth detention center in Baltimore. So and then kind of you know, and they look very similar. And, you know, so kind of taking these experiences, unpacking these experiences around like systems of control and kind of working through those things like through the work, you know. And you know, people definitely had some things to say about the performance where I kind of interned myself, but like and for me it was always more of like a symbolic gesture as opposed to like, you know, because that's the thing, it's almost just like filmmaking. It's like you aren't like, it isn't meant to like one-to-one perfectly recreate the thing you're alluding to, because you're alluding to something. Right. And I think that like, you know, for instance, one of my favorite sayings is that like you focus on a tree, you miss the whole forest, and like people will hyper focus on like one individual aspect and like miss the entire point. You know, like, and me and my best friend Emmanuel Macion, who conceived the performance with me, it was his idea that I did it. He's the only person I'd ever do that for, and you know, he was saying about how like people, it was interesting how some people, the people that did get mad, they got more mad about us doing it than they seemed to be mad about the issue that we're trying to raise awareness about.
Yeah, know? I thought that was so interesting because in the Guardian article, the interview they did with you in the Guardian, which I'll share with y'all, I thought your response to that was interesting because you're like, you don't want to make art about like some other escape, like an escapist kind of reality. Like this is what's actually affecting your community now. Mm-hmm. So it's like, as opposed to getting mad about the performance piece, it's like, well, how about we highlight what's actually going on, which is the fact that tons of black and brown people continue to be incarcerated at insane levels.
I was not put on this earth. I think I say this all the time. I was not put on this earth to make beautiful things, but then by virtue of me like making things that are true and genuine to myself, I end up making beautiful things. You know.
It's a bar. The last thing I want to ask is just, so these are 3D scans of you in Sojourn.
Yes.
And I feel like that's really important considering that you said that you're working through an existential crisis while making the movie. So like, talk about why you're in it. Like what is the role that you play in the film? Because all those guys at the end, like the different versions, that's all 3D scans of you, Allen-Golder Carpenter.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, I mean, because, I mean, on the one hand, it is like conceptual, where it's like I am like kind of dealing with my own perception of self, my own perception of like kind of the role and aesthetic perception of like black men in American society, like the idea of the black hooded figure, you know, which is like kind of this like image of fear, but also like this image of like pride and like kind of in rap culture, you know, like one of the reference images was like this like performance that Kanye did on stage with like
hundreds of people from
like 50 rappers and all black with hoods on from the UK. It was like you know, but then also like it's also like and then the fact that they're all just copies of the same person, which is ultimately me, is like kind of like an allusion to the illusion that like people are separate from each other. You know, and because when souls pass on, they all look the same, but then also it's like kind of a utilitarian kind of like limitation kind of thing, where it's like I have access to myself more than I have access to anyone else, you know. And I got my other best friend Andy to like 3D scan me like in my backyard like for like 2 hours in like the blazing heat wearing like all black, you know. Like I voiced the main character because it would have been way too much work to cast someone and direct them. Like when I know how I want this character to sound, like I know what the lines are. If I need to change them, I can reread them at any time. So it's as much like kind of practical as it is conceptual. And and for instance, like so many of those 3D scans are like very broken and incomplete, you know, and instead of like kind of spending all day out there trying to get perfect scans of me, I decided to kind of lean into that and like kind of involve it in like the philosophy of the film, you know. So like the process breeds the philosophy.
Yeah, the process is the work just as much as the final product, maybe even more so. Yeah. I think your work continues to be an incredible response to the systems of power that we inhabit or that we live in today. But I think it's also interesting that you said you go with what hits your soul ultimately, you know, but nonetheless, it almost ends up speaking to our reality, even beyond having like a sought out message. But thank you so much for visiting us and for showing your work.
Thank you for having me.